Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see so many folks. And like Lisa, I am really looking forward to getting to know more and more of you. I already have some hikes scheduled, so thank you for that. I'm Jim Falk, and as Lisa said, I now have the opportunity and the great privilege of being chair of the program committee. So as events began to really percolate in Ukraine, Ambassador Esquino and others, we started talking about who might be the very best person to have come speak about what's happening. And somebody said George Friedman. And I said, George Friedman? He's my friend. I hope he'll agree with that. George, I have introduced George probably 4 or 5 times in my career, and it is always such a pleasure to be with George and his wonderful wife, Meredith, who truly is his right hand in so many ways. Meredith, great to see you, and thanks for making the special effort to come here. You can imagine just how busy the Friedmans are with what's going on in the world and running one of the most interesting, important we'll see how he describes it, but it is a think tank in a way, and it's Geopolitical Futures. George created this organization now, I guess it's about 4 or 5 years ago. He founded an organization called Stratfor, also based in Austin, in 1996. And he decided that that was reaching an audience that he didn't feel that needed to be reached in the same way. And that's why I created Geopolitical Futures. And Lisa, when I was listening to your remarks, it made me very glad that I took out a few phrases from the mission statement of Geopolitical Futures. So allow me to read those. Above all, Geopolitical Futures is an intellectual undertaking, an ongoing experiment in finding order in the apparent chaos of the world. We are a business that lives the life of the mind. We believe that liberal democracy can survive only if there's a segment of society which we call the learned public, who is not caught up in the passions of the moment, but is eager to look at the world as it is. As George says, they don't cover the news, they go much farther, and they talk about the history. When I picked George and Meredith up a few minutes ago, I have to be honest, I turned down CNN. I didn't want them to think that I was addicted as I am. Let me just quickly tell you a few highlights about Dr. Friedman. He's of Hungarian descent, born of Jewish parents who survived the Holocaust, but then they fled communism by going to Austria, where they were in a refugee camp. And then they eventually made it to the United States, where his dad was a typesetter for the New York Times. I'm a longtime subscriber to both Stratfor before and now Geopolitical Futures. And I just want to give you a sense of some of the things that you might get. And they didn't ask me to sit up here and promote Geopolitical Futures, but I'm going to do it anyway. Just every week, sometimes twice a week, you'll see an email from George, from the desk of George Friedman. Let me read you 3 titles. War, Hatred, and Exhaustion. Historical Phases and Transitions. The Pain and Pleasure of Being Right. Another email that I love getting from Geopolitical Futures is what we are reading. I always feel good when I'm reading the same book, but more often than not, I have to add their book to my list. They've also prepared last year The World Ahead in 2022, and it's a terrific forecast that they prepare. Some of the books that George has written include The Storm Before the Calm, The Next 100 Years of Forecasts for the 21st Century, The Next Decade, America's Secret War. And he's often right, but another amazing thing about Dr. Friedman is when he's wrong, he's not afraid to tell you that either. So with that, Dr. George Friedman, come on up.
He has never asked me to speak here. He's asked Meredith, who told me to speak here. He understands the system. My father was, in fact, a typesetter for the Times. He had one problem. He didn't speak English. This may not have seemed major to you, but for typesetter, it's a problem. In those days, it was hand done, and if you remember the New York Times, there were many typos. It contained many typos. That was my father. Thank you, Jim. I founded these organizations because in a liberal democracy, foreign policy cannot belong to the technocracy. It cannot belong to those who make their living doing this. It has to belong to the citizenry. But foreign policy is difficult. Foreign policy may not be exciting. And the citizens don't want to do that work, and it's understandable. But to maintain a democracy, to have wars only when they're in the interest of the people, and to avoid wars when they're not, I mean, this requires more than politicians, more than PhDs, and more than experts. Because you are experts in your lives, and this affects it. So that's how I approach this. I approach it pretentiously as a public service, and practically as a way to live without having to live in Washington, doing what I do. When I left Washington, I got to the border, and I turned around and I spat, and I kept going. I don't like Washington. So I want to speak to you about a war that we're sort of involved in, and who knows where it goes. And I want to speak to you in a way that I wrote a paper about intelligence and love. And by that I don't mean, some movie. I mean the fact that you cannot conduct intelligence if you don't love your subject. And by love your subject, understand him so completely that you could be him, or even want to be him. And then you can kill him. And I say that not to be shocking. But America loses wars when it feels good about itself. It loses wars when it feels contempt for its enemy. It loses wars when it doesn't penetrate so deep that he loves who he is. So I want to talk to you about Russia and Iraq. I'm sorry, wrong war. I've been doing that lately. Ukraine. No, my daughter was in Iraq as an intelligence officer. And ever since then, I'm fixated in Iraq. I can't stop. So where does the story of this war begin? In the airport at Pristina in Kosovo. The United States and NATO went to war for the first time against Serbia. They had never been collectively in a war. And that war was designed to stop genocide. There had been genuine genocide of Bosnians by the Serbs. Now they were afraid that it would happen again in Kosovo. And the solution they found, having not thought about it much, is to bomb Belgrade, including bridges and, for some reason, the second story of the Chinese embassy. But something was up. So they waged this war, and as all American wars, they wanted to stop it. But as with all American wars, the wars don't stop simply because you want it to end. And so they reached out to the Russians. The Russians had an excellent relationship with the Serbs and police, particularly with Milosevic. And they went to the leaders and raised the question, okay, how can you help us? And Boris Yeltsin appointed a man, Chernomyrdin, who had been prime minister, and who negotiated a settlement with Milosevic. Now, there was rumors of the settlement included large sums of money, but I'm sure that wasn't true. But at any rate, the Russians wanted one thing. Chernomyrdin said one thing. If this is going to happen, then the peacekeepers have to include Russians. There has to be a Russian component to the peacekeeping force in Kosovo. And some GS-14 said, sure, having no authorization. And a Russian aircraft landed at Pristina, which was the airport in Kosovo, to begin the process. And they were surrounded by troops of NATO and kept on the airfield. Partly as a result of this, Yeltsin fell. Yeltsin was forced out of office. Chernomyrdin later died from an unknown disease, but that he was. And a man came forward to rectify this problem, Yeltsin. This is how Yeltsin in 2000 became president. Now, for Yeltsin, as a KGB officer, would be about the same as for a CIA officer. This didn't happen to us. There was a reason this happened. We didn't understand it. What was the reason that there was so much contempt for us that even a solemn agreement, the Americans, and believe me, they don't believe in NATO, they believe in Americans, the Americans wouldn't keep. And this is how Yeltsin came into office. I'm sorry. Yeah, this I'm going to do a lot, okay? There are a lot of names and I get them wrong. All right, this is how Putin came into office. Putin had to respond somehow, but there was no response he could make. He dealt with internal crises, Chechnya, and developed a way of putting down rebellions. Not a nice way, but he put it down. But if I were Yeltsin, what would I do? Could we just assume that you know who I say? All right, Meredith, wave your arms. Putin was lost. I mean, how did we get, we Russians, we who defeated Hitler, how did we get to the point where they dare surround our airplane? How do we get to the point where the Americans are shipping weapons through the Pankisi Gorge into Georgia, into southern Russia, Chechnya? Now, were we shipping them? I don't know. He believed it. Is it inconceivable that we were doing it? No. So how could this be happening? And he took Chechnya and crushed it. But it wasn't enough. The Pankisi Gorge had two sides, one in Chechnya, one in Georgia. And in 2008, he attacked Georgia. The strategic purpose was to demonstrate that Russia could act. It was not any great strategic understanding beyond the fact that he was being held in contempt by the West. They did not believe that Russia could organize an offensive action, so he did. All his life, he was trying to restore respect for Russia. And all his life, the Americans were hitting him back. Hitting him back, hitting him back. The worst place happened in 2014, in the Maidan Square, where from his point of view, the constitutionally elected government was one Sunday morning replaced. The president of Ukraine sent into exile in Russia, and the Americans serving as advisors to a new government that didn't quite know where the bathroom was. So this is where he was. So how did this happen? How did the Americans take control of Ukraine? But his thinking went farther than this. Okay? His thinking was the following. M3 is a road that leads from the Ukrainian border to Moscow. It is 263 miles long. The Americans were now 263 miles from Moscow. When the Germans began their war, they were 1,500 miles from Moscow. When Napoleon began his war, I don't know how far it was, but it was far. The Swedes, very few know about the Swedish invasions, started the war. The one thing that any Russian strategist knows is that Russia survives by strategic depth. Hitler started his attack in June. Because of the distance that he had to go, he didn't reach Moscow till the winter, which is a bad time to show up in Moscow. What the Americans didn't understand is the Russian obsession with strategic depth. The idea that the existence of Russia depends on buffer zones. And the single buffer zone that was most important to a Russian strategist was Ukraine. This vast area out of which Stalingrad came. This was now, in his mind, in the hands of the Americans. In the minds of the Americans, we just being nice, we liberated the place. We had no ambitions. But the Russian view was you always have ambitions. You always pretend to be nice. You're not nice. You're Americans. And once you invade somebody, they have to say thank you. So this is overstating the Russian point of view, but not very much. The degree to which the Russians believe Americans to be massive hypocrites, constantly doing good while benefiting themselves, is unanswerable. So extraordinarily, Putin didn't trust the Americans. Okay? He didn't trust Obama. He didn't trust anyone. And he looked at the map and he understood that the country that he was ruling was one step away from death. If Americans send in troops to Ukraine, which we could have, 263 miles from Moscow, not enough time to respond, not enough time to maneuver, not enough time to make mistakes. All Russian wars begin with massive errors. You have to recover from it. It wasn't possible. He looked around the map, and what had been lost? Well, all the buffer zones. The South Caucasus, the North European plain, the Central Asia, all gone. And so he set about with a strategy of regaining the borderlands. Okay. In the Northeast, the gentle coup where Lukashenko sort of stole the election and maybe didn't. He comes in gently, supporting Lukashenko, and today owns Belarus. In the South Caucasus, there's a war, partly started by the Russians, between Azerbaijan and Armenia over a place called Nagorno-Karabakh. I once went to Azerbaijan and they had a television interview, and they said, "What is the American position on Nagorno-Karabakh?" I said, "We have no position. Something has to be done." I said, "Do it." They cut off the interview. You want to invade them? Invade them. I don't care. But all through Central Asia, uncertainty. Russia's fear is the North European plain. The plain that starts at Paris, swings all the way to Moscow, is flat. It is the route to invade Russia. And Belarus is an unstable place. Turkey has invaded Russia many times. It can't invade it again. Ha! The one thing the Russians know is that the thing that is impossible this year, next year becomes possible. And it's wide open. The North Caucasus is there, but they can be penetrated too. And Central Asia has God knows what going on. The Americans are fighting in Afghanistan. They have planes in this place and oil companies in that place. The Russians cannot believe we're not up to something. The idea that Americans say, hey, it's an oil company, has nothing to do with anything. This they don't believe. They cannot grasp the fact that there's not some central force guiding us. The idea of a society this powerful, this wealthy, that rose out of the primordial muck without ever having an organizational principle is beyond them. So everything that they see has a meaning. Everything they look at has a purpose, and somebody designed it. And he set about to reverse it. Since 2020, he has reversed what he saw was a strategic catastrophe. First, in Belarus, a soft coup, taking over the place. The tanks attacking Ukraine came from there. In the South Caucasus, he took control away from the Turks, who were there too, and had peace talks himself, and then sent 10,000 troops in as peacekeepers to enforce the truce he had. Now, there's not 10,000 there, and I haven't counted them lately, but there are enough there to scare anybody. In Kazakhstan, there were riots out of nowhere going on in the streets. And he sent in peacekeepers to aid the Kazakh people in protecting the rights. Well, if we lost Texas and we lost Washington State and maybe Florida, then we could understand what we're looking at, especially if you lost Texas. So he created 3 buffers, but the key buffer wasn't there. Ukraine, with M3, the road, straight up. And he had to have that. And he demanded one thing, which is symbolic, that Ukraine never be allowed to be in NATO. Now, Ukraine had never been in NATO. NATO never wanted Ukraine. But Putin doesn't think that way. Putin says, what will happen tomorrow? Okay? And he wanted that. And he felt that the only reason the Americans refused him was they intended it as a jumping off point. Why not give us what we need? The Americans say, because it's a sovereign country, we can't touch them. Sovereign schmavern. You stole the whole of North America from the Indians. That was okay. He didn't say that. He probably didn't know it. But it was the way he looked at it. That the Americans would say, because it's a sovereign country, and he would think of all the sovereign countries, like Serbia, which we bombed. Okay. So, he decided that he had no choice but to attack. Now, the war itself is interesting because it was the only war when both the Americans and the Russians agreed on what would happen. The Ukrainians would collapse. There was the chairman of Joint Chiefs gave them 72 hours. Putin gave them 5 days. You know, he was generous. But Putin deployed his forces in an irrational way. And this is where the story becomes more difficult. He created 3 armored groups. One located just west of Voronezh, east of Voronezh. One in Belarus. That one was coming down to Kiev. The one in the east was going to the eastern frontier. And one in Crimea. It looked like Heinz Guderian had been resurrected from the grave. This was a World War II structure and the typical problem of the Russian army. They've never gotten over Marshal Zhukov. If Marshal Zhukov attacked with tanks, we have to have tanks. During the Cold War, when I had some responsibility in trying to find out what the Russians were doing, it was an amazing thing. They were going to run on armor alone, leaving infantry behind. Now here's a secret. Tanks use gasoline or petroleum. And they never figured out how to keep up the gasoline trucks with the tanks. Or better yet, how not to get the gasoline trucks blown up with the tanks. They had all sorts of solutions, such as plastic pipes running, okay? And the problem with plastic pipes is they leaked. So you figured they would fix it. So you go back next year and watch the same exercise, same leaking pipe. Okay. The same sort of action was taken in Iraq, in Ukraine, which is first he had 3 armored groups, uncoordinated with infantry, almost impossible to manage at 200 miles apart, with 3 different loads of logistics required to run the tanks. And so he's attacking on 3 fronts in a country he thought would collapse. The result was, if you remember, the 40-kilometer line of tanks lined up. This was done, I believe, with 2 Javelin missiles knocking out the first 2 tanks, 2 Javelin missiles knocking out the last 2 tanks, and God took care of the mud on the right. One train was blocked. Another was not going very far. They were engaging along the frontier. And a final force that was supposed to go to Kiev couldn't get close to it. The psychological effect on the Ukrainians was enormous. What they also thought they would lose. They had thought that the Russians had a magnificent military force and knew how to operate. None of them, except for your grandfathers there, had ever fought in the Russian army and knew better. The transformation that took place in Ukraine on realizing that the Russians really were unable to mount an effective offensive transformed the war. Suddenly the Ukrainians saw there was a purpose to fight. And the Russians had no real solution because they had not bought infantry. They wanted an armored war. They didn't bring in infantry until later, and the infantry said basically, where am I? Why am I here? The infantry was completely unprepared and then threw them into house-to-house fighting. Now, house-to-house fighting is ugly. But when you're attacking somebody's house who lives in it, and he knows where the bathroom is, I mean, this is really putting you at a disadvantage. Every possible way to ambush you, every possible rooftop that you could be taken from, was knocking out massive casualties. Numbers we couldn't believe at the time, but were true. Was knocking out the Russians. In other words, the Russians had not planned the war, except on the assumption that the fact of an attack would paralyze the Ukrainians. Well, it did. Until they sat there and watched the Javelin missiles knocking out tanks, and they realized that their rifles could kill Russians too. And then the war changed. Up to that point, the Americans had given precious little equipment to the Ukrainians. We didn't want to give it to the Russians. Until then, the Ukrainians were fighting a guerrilla war without central command, which seems foolish, except without a central command, there was no Schwerpunkt, so I could do it in German, Schwerpunkt to hit. There was no center of gravity of the enemy. There's no command structure that you could find. And the Russians milled around incoherently. They decided to do what the Russian army has always done when not clear of what to do. They started killing people randomly. They started attacking cities. Now, cities are not places to fight wars. They're places to show after you win. But they went into the cities, and when they couldn't take the cities, then the air power, which had never been coordinated with the tanks before, now coordinated with the infantry, bombing cities. The problem with bombing cities is you didn't kill soldiers. You killed civilians. Bombing the cities created a sense of terror, but also a sense of rage. And the attack that was taken was by the new commander who had fought in Syria and had been done very well in Syria. And nobody told Putin it's not Syria. You have a completely different structure that you had to face. So the Russians conducted an attack, fighting for a month for one lousy town, Mariupol, making it a martyr and spending how many troops at how much time. Because the Russians understood they only had so much time. They only had so much time, their own people who tolerate this, but far more, they did not know what the Americans were going to do. And you have to understand how afraid the Russians are of Americans. Okay? When will the Americans come in? When will they come in? We didn't. There was no reason to come in. You want to fight like this for a month for Mariupol? We'll give you another city. Which do you like next? Urban warfare does not win wars. Not this kind of war. Okay? So they decided to fight for the Donbass region, which they already controlled because it's predominantly Russian, and they'd always controlled the area, so they're going to have a new fight for it. Okay? They were going to give up the attempt to take Kiev, which was a very good idea because the tanks were still on the road somewhere. Okay? And they were going to fight for the south. They were going to take the south and try to join to Odessa. Theoretically, not a bad idea. But the problem here was that at this point, the Ukrainians had gotten a measure of the war, and the Americans changed their minds. And this was the key. Up until this weekend, the American view was, however long this takes, the Russians are going to kick their butts. But in the week prior to that, during conversations, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs says, I may have been wrong. Yeah, it's okay. Now what do you say? Ukrainians can hold. What do the Ukrainians need to be able to hold? And if you saw the list of weapons, we have suddenly armed a modern army. Ukraine, in the next month, will cease to be a bunch of guys with rifles and guts, but become the U.S. Army. Repeat with every complex weapon. Now, truth be told, the Poles have been training a lot of the Ukrainians in how to do these things. Poland is a kind of base for Ukraine and for the United States. We will deliver the weapons there, and the Ukrainians will suddenly, miraculously know how to use them. After this war, there's a Polish story. You know Polish jokes? This is a good one. So after this, all right, the Russians have a huge problem. The Americans have come. And they've come the way the Americans always come to a party, bearing big gifts. Okay? And the Americans are in, they don't want to lose. They lose, but they don't want to. But they're coming in with enough power and no American troops. Only Ukrainian troops and U.S. Special Forces, the British Special Forces, and, a few guys from Poland, nothing serious. But we're coming in. Now you're Putin. You're seeing all of this go away. Everything you dreamt of. Recreating a secure Russia. Okay? So he has two choices. Hit him now hard with everything he has, which suffers from the question of how much does he have? Does he really have anything? Or is he flittered away in foolish activities? Or try to make a deal. If there was ever a moment for the Russians to make a deal, it's now, but the Russians can never make a deal when they're weak. The Russians must be strong. So one way to do it is have this Chairman, I have never seen an amazing army like the Russians. They are so strong. Let's talk. This is one sort of way we could do it, but we won't. Okay? Because now we can win. For the first time, the United States believes the Ukrainians can win. The Ukrainians no longer simply think they can hold. They think they can win. And the Poles always thought they could win. And if they didn't, sorry guys. So what we have here now is Putin's worst nightmare. And that's when Russians are dangerous, when they confront their mortality. It's very interesting that we've suddenly had a spate of articles out of the Western press about his Parkinson's disease. I'm sure this is not planned by anybody, but if it were, it would certainly tell his followers, you know, the man is dying, you know, maybe you want to give him a rest. And so we are down at this point where the Russians need to make a move. Now, understand how important this is to Russia. Understand that the frivolous coverage about Russia having no reason to do this but sheer meanness is not true. That the Russian reasons for doing it make absolute sense, and then we can kill them. You gotta love them to kill them. That was the point. How do we kill them? Doing exactly what Biden did, to my stunning surprise. He provided them he provided the Ukrainians with top-of-the-line capabilities. Radar systems, the ability to knock out aircraft at high altitudes, more aircraft, unmanned aerial vehicles, a range of weapons that we would go to fight with. They say it'll take a month to transfer and integrate. Who knows? But if you're the Russians, now you have to do something. And Moscow has been stunningly silent. Now, those of us who study Russia know that silence is not a good sign. But they are very quiet. They have not said anything. And we are coming down to this point. If we hold Ukraine, Russia will, I think, go through its second collapse. The first collapse of Russia solved nothing. This first collapse of the Soviet Union didn't solve the institutional problems, didn't solve the economic problems, didn't solve any of the problems. Putin was the man who was going to not be Yeltsin, which was an important thing, but also was going to create a new, modern, powerful Russia. Defeat, it fails. What is the next upheaval? But having paid a tremendous price over the years, to be defeated once again, well, this is going to be very hard for any Russian to take. And as in 1917, Russians, when they face defeat, overthrow the Tsar. So this is approaching a very dangerous point. The other option the Russians have is to hit the Ukrainians, hit them hard, and bomb Poland, bomb those bases. They've got to stop those weapons from coming in and being distributed. Once they're in, they're going to be doing them wholesale. Okay, we're shooting 1, 2, 3, 4. Right now, the plane lands at the airport, hit one, all shipments will be stopped. The Americans probably won't do anything. The term probably is a very tough, troubling term to the Russians and to everyone. And so we are here at the cusp of the war. The war has reached a critical point at which fundamental Russian interests are at stake and fundamental American interests. We have a fundamental interest in having any one power conquer Europe. We exist because there is no power that can invade us by land. We can only be invaded from the sea. And therefore, the control of the sea is critical. And you control the sea by making sure no one else can build fleets, hence the Cold War. And by making sure that he doesn't take Europe, he takes that option away. And we can sit here nice and happy and enjoy ourselves. And Putin knows all of these things, and now he's desperate. I've never seen Putin desperate. He's trained not to be desperate. But we will see. As for the United States, a proxy war that we can fight is something we haven't had in a good time, in a good long time. It's been a while since we've had one. Maybe even win? Well, maybe not, we'll see. But we are now at the point where two great powers confront each other, each having absolutely legitimate rights, legitimate claims. And it doesn't make any difference, because power is what determines the outcome. Being right in foreign policy makes no difference, because your being right is someone else being wrong, and someone else's being wrong can mean everything to them. So understand Putin, understand what he's going through, understand that what he hoped would be the extraordinary achievement of Russian ruler, better than Peter the Great, flowing through his hands. And his hated enemy, who he told to hate in the KGB, doing the job on him. And remember, Americans, that you live in a nasty world, and that goodwill is not a commodity that carries much weight. Power matters, and this is as clear a story of this war as I can give. Let me stop here.
Thank you, George. I'd like to take questions from the audience, and we do have a microphone that will be coming your direction. Lots of questions. Let's go back to that second table there. He was the first. You, sir, with I believe that's a yellow shirt and a sweater.
Ophthalmologist would be thrilled. Where does China fit in this whole picture of what's going on right now?
China is a lifetime ally of Russia, and they will do two great things together, except give weapons to the Russians or vehicles to the Russians. The Chinese made a very bad move, which is they entered into a relationship with a country that they assumed had a much more powerful military than it did. And that means that Xi has some things to answer for, but no harm has been done yet. But China has a much deeper problem. Its economic problem resembles that of Japan in 1991. Its financial system is completely skewed. Its dependence on exports skews the entire Chinese system, especially with its largest customers, the United States, given to fits, tantrums, and what else. Okay? Dependent on the United States. The United States is deeply involved against the Russians. Doesn't absolutely need those Chinese exports. China can only go so far, pissing us off. They can do good, but only that far. As for invading Taiwan, there's two ways to answer this. One, why didn't they do it already? Shut up and do it. And the other thing is you can't. China has 6 amphibious transport craft, possibly 8. In order to take Taiwan, all those 8 have to land at the same beach at the same time to give you power to hold a beach and move forward. It will take 6 to 9 hours after fully loaded for those ships to cross the Taiwan Strait. During that time, the number of missiles that can be fired at those boats are pretty extraordinary. And that's why the Chinese never did it, because the Chinese know perfectly well that their vulnerability of an amphibious assault is just overwhelming. So we have China now dealing with internal problems. The most incomprehensible is the shutdown of a city, the crucial financial center of a city in the middle of a financial crisis. Or maybe they had to shut it down in the middle of a financial crisis to find another reason for it. But we know that even Australia has opened up. New Zealand will let people in. I mean, every country is relaxing. They either have let loose another really weird disease, or they need a reason to shut down Shanghai. I don't know what it might be, but they have a meeting of the Central Committee in 3 weeks. Not the big meeting, but the little meeting where really things happen. And at that meeting, somebody's going to say, hey, Xi, how come everybody in the world has opened up and you're shutting down Shanghai and thinking about shutting down Beijing? And Xi has to have an answer. And whatever that answer is going to be, I don't know, but it doesn't make sense. So we look at China. They made an agreement. It doesn't really have any substance to it given this invasion of Ukraine. Their economy is imbalanced in the extreme. They're really going to go through the kind of thing the United States went through in 1929. In 1880, we started being the world's producer of low-grade schlock being sent out for everybody. By 1910, we were producing half the world's low-grade schlock, plus some good stuff too. When they couldn't buy it anymore, we held a depression. Japan was in exactly the same position in 1990. They had been the low-grade schlock producer for my lifetime. It was made in Japan, wasn't a joke. Then they upgraded to tech and all sorts of other things, which is very good. Then they decided to hold a meltdown, the lost decade, they called it. Why, I don't know. You do not have permanent economic growth anywhere. There's something called the business cycle. There's the long cycle, there's a short cycle, and it will get you. And China's now reached a long cycle. So this is a country with a lot of problems. That plus the fact that cities keep getting closed and nobody can leave. That's interesting.
Take from the Vice President, David Killian.
Fascinating talk.
Take the microphone, David, so other people can hear you, please.
Fascinating talk. I was thinking about President Biden while you were speaking. Fox News has taught the Republicans in our country to see Joe Biden as deep into dementia, needing rest all the time, unable to be a leader, and yet he seemed to be one step ahead of everyone else in this crisis.
We said the same thing about Trump, his enemies. He's an idiot, he's a fool, he's this and that. He did some pretty smart things in foreign policy. He created peace in the Middle East, little things like that. Yeah. So we have a habit of belittling our presidents. I don't pay attention to that. I don't care who's president. He's just a guy. I look at the forces driving the nation. Okay? Nations are vast machines, and there are powers that shape them. Any man who becomes president knows how to align himself with that power. Donald Trump knew how to become president at that time. Biden knew how to become president. And yes, everybody opposes him, says that he's senile, and everybody who looks at Trump says that he was a criminal. And yet, this is America. That's good.
Okay, so you're not a level one analyst. I can hear you say that, but I guess my question is, Biden has seemed to be very adept at playing Putin. He released our intelligence. That hadn't been done before. He was able to rally Europe and NATO very quickly. He was the first person to call for Putin's removal from power. He was the first person to call Bucha a genocide. And last night we have the new Biden policy in this war from Secretary Austin, who said that our goal now is to weaken Russia so that they can't do this again, presumably so that they can't threaten their neighbors. Would this have happened if President Obama was president right now?
First of all, the president does not make policy. He has policy options given to him, all right? Secondly, the idea that all these things, Biden's decided this, Biden decided that, no, he didn't. It was part of the system that was set in place. We elected a Democratic Party who faced an invasion of Ukraine. If the Republican Party had faced the invasion of Ukraine, we would have the same options. The idea that somehow the president is on these vast things, I can't even remember the name of Ukraine. to think that these people this is a personalized government, kingship, this is not the way it is. This is a system of leadership that produces certain predictable outcomes. The reason I can, to some extent, predict history, because I don't really care about Putin. If Putin had been shot in the head, another Putin would have arrived, because someone had to defend the borderlands. Because you can't be a Russian leader or not. And the United States had to defend the Ukrainians. And he didn't have to, he could say that that's what we should do, but really is a system of governance that compels them in certain directions. I doubt very much that Trump had any idea that the Abraham covenants meant anything. But we can now call him a genius, if you will. Biden clearly is a fool. How could he not be? I didn't vote for him. You know, one of the things about my company, my principles, my intellectual property, is minimizing the influence of individuals on history, seeing individuals trapped by historical forces, given a number of choices, okay? So, you know, you always ask the question, do you think World War II would have wound up different if Roosevelt had croaked 3 years before? The system was in place. It had to happen. So if that's not true, then we all live at the whim of half-wits. If it is true, then the half-wits get to be president, and we get to live. So my view of it is, and what makes it possible to forecast, is to see the necessity embedded in the system. You know, it's kind of like judging a company by saying, I think the CEO is a moron. You know, you've really huge company. You know, you can be pretty dumb and still get by.
Other questions?
Cynical? No, I'm extremely idealistic. I believe that our future does not depend on one man. I believe it depends on a system of power that we've created. That's not cynicism.
Brooke, let's see, we're going to get a question right over here.
He can't.
Although I thought that was an important comment, so thank you. Let me give you an alternative view of motivation and causes here. Is this on?
I don't think.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, you're right. You're right. You're talking about Putin, or Putin and his system, with the new addendum you just gave, sort of being negative and defensive. The reason for this conflict was to protect the borders, to not have them get any closer to Moscow. And perhaps that's right. I look at Putin and what I see is that there's a positive thing, a desire there, not just a fear. And it's the desire to make Russia glorious, to make himself glorious. Slava Russia, Slava Putin. That seems to me to be a positive thing. Sorry to say, my view, I think, gives us worse outcomes. I still think it's true.
Well,
because it's harder to stop a person who has a desire than it is to stop a person who has a fear.
The last time I met Putin, he and I had a long talk, and he told me this is what he thought. No, I've never met Putin. I've never had a conversation with him. You've never met Putin. We can infer any motives we want. But we also have to ask the question of the imperative. What must a secure Russia have? The United States must control the seas. We need that. The Russians must control their borderlands. Whatever he's thinking, whatever he's doing, the actions he took cohere with the apparent imperatives that are needed. The idea that Russia, having been invaded by the Germans, having been invaded by the Swedes, have been invaded by the French, now will expect a foreign, possibly hostile powers 200 miles away from their capital city is unlikely. If he wants glory as well, then that may be it. But, you know, first, shine your shoes. You got to take this. I don't see any difference in what Stalin did what Lenin wanted, or what the Tsars wanted. They created this entity. They're very different people. They may have wanted glory. It may well be one of the things. But if you look and see the rationality between what he's doing, then you can say, okay, so 10 years ago in a book, I wrote that one of the things that would happen was that the Russians would invade Ukraine. They will go and do that. I wrote it in the next 100 years. I've been writing that frequently, particularly after the 14th, that you've given, 2014, that you've given the Russians no choice but to do this at some point. Now, he may have other motives. I don't know him. I know that I have desire for great glory. I won't probably get it, but, you know. But the point that I'm making is that if you take the imperatives that a nation must have, very simple, very stupid, the constraints, what it can and can't do, then what emerges is what's possible and what's necessary. And aside from that, by all means, you know, be a hero.
Vicki?
Hi. This is the best Global Santa Fe lecture I've ever heard, including the galas, so thank you very much. I'd like you kind of to stretch this out a little bit, assuming, and maybe I'm incorrect, that U.S. Goals have now changed in the war, and they're probably regime change. What is the likely outcome? Yes, Putin falls, but then what?
Well, if Putin falls, then the post-communist world is refuted. Then the idea of communism without a party is gone. It's amazing how similar Russia is to the communist period after Stalin. It's a continuation. But it had a mission, an internal mission, another imperative, which is to enrich the people. Russia right now has a lower GDP than South Korea, which I pick arbitrarily, but that's a small country, and is ranked 86th in the world in per capita income. The promise that was made when communism was overthrown was that we will become not just a powerful country, but a prosperous country. And that hasn't happened. And the Russian public still wants that. Yes, they remember from their grandfather what it meant to fight outside of Moscow. That was clear. They remember. But they also want something more. And the internal problem is that Russia as a structure can't deliver it. Okay? Russia is a poor country by nature. And it's a poor country that lives in a world of prosperity, and the envy of the public is real. So what happens now? They continue this desperate search for prosperity while harboring the deep fear of what happened in the past. So it's a country that's uneasy and sometimes reckless.
We'll take one more question in the back. We'll take two more questions, two quick questions. You know, you sit at that table, sometimes you get your question asked. There you go.
Do you think, George, that that Putin would fall faster if the Russian public knew what was actually happening? How many, the terrible war crimes that were being committed, which many of them don't know about, you know, the little babichki in the country looking at propaganda television do not know. This is for me and many. It's so disturbing that they don't know what their country, what's being done in their name.
I think they know far more. It's not television, but the stories of their grandparents. And those stories go down generations. And I can tell the story of my Hungarian family going back a long time. And they expect war to be brutal, because every war they fought in was brutal. And when the decision was made to go in, they understood it, sort of. But brutality is not alien to the Russian culture, neither to themselves nor to others. As Americans, we'd be appalled if our troops did this, so we make it very careful that nobody tells them. But for the Russians, okay, you assume that they're appalled. When they went to war, it's what they expected of it. And that's where we differ, and we really have to respect them. This is so important for them that they will absorb that. Failure, if it's ours or someone else's, that's where they pay. So the glory comes first from having the job, and then you have to perform. So I would argue that they would not be appalled. I think they understand war far better than we do. And they understand how Russians fight.
Last question right here. Steve? The microphone, it's on its way.
It's kind of a two-part question. First is, I understand the theory of strategic depth, but does it mean so much these days when we have nuclear weapons?
Well, the first thing we have to ask is why haven't nuclear weapons not been used? Okay, so we've had them for a while, like since 1945. It's because when Putin goes to war, or Biden goes to war, his family's going to live through it. If you go to nuclear weapons, they're going to die. I once had a friend, a pilot, B-52 pilot, flying out of Plattsburgh Air Force Base, no longer in service. And we were talking about, you know, he'd be in that first wave. He said, the only thing I think about are my kids. I'm not worried about the target. I'm just imagining the response. So nuclear war is difficult because it is the only type of war we've developed in which your grandchildren will likely die.
Well, that leads to the second part of the question is, it isn't the use of nuclear weapons, it's the threat thereof. And what's the future of non-proliferation when a bunch of dictators around the world figure out that nobody's going to come at me if I have this potential?
Well, we're coming at the Russians, and they have that potential. So much for that theory. And the Vietnamese didn't have any problem kicking our butts, even though we had nuclear weapons. And the Israelis almost were overrun by the Arabs in 1973, and they had nuclear weapons. So the extraordinary thing is that nations are prepared to lose wars, or come close to losing wars, and not go nuclear. And the reason for that is the consequences of going nuclear are not abstract. 1,800 dead Ukrainians, yeah, it's an abstract figure. But the idea that 30 seconds after I order this launch, my family's gone, that becomes very concrete. And this is why I believe, having spoken to people, I don't think they'd launch. I don't think the chain of command would accept that order. It hasn't, I don't know that it's ever happened. I don't think it ever happened. But I think that the riveting moment of being in that chain of command is the realization that you've just killed your kids. And that's why every time Putin orders something in Ukraine, that's in Ukraine. When he orders a nuclear attack, that's him. I don't know if he loves himself or anybody else, never met the man, but I don't know. All I know is that nations, empirically, have faced catastrophic outcomes and neither hesitated to go to war nor really threatened nuclear weapons. The empirical fact is they're there, and unless you're willing to say that if someone has a nuclear weapon, you will allow him to carry out any operations that he wants, then we're back in my place.
I guess for George Friedman, that's an optimistic note.
I don't know why she calls me a cynic.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Friedman. You know, I do want you to know something. Sometimes Dr. Friedman charges honoraria. And he didn't today because I said, George, I promise you our audience is learned and our readers. So I hope you'll pick up a copy of the paperback book. I promise you'll find it interesting. George, would you stay around and personally inscribe some? I think you will, knowing you. So I think, Dorothy, you'll be over there to sell some books, and I know Lisa has a few concluding remarks.
I wanted to thank you, but I also want to encourage you to continue the conversation. And we are all about dialogue and diplomacy. So this discussion doesn't end here. You will get another perspective that I suspect will be somewhat different next week, as Ben Rhodes is our speaker, and he also has written a book and will be eager for your questions. I know I'm eager for your questions. And many of you will hear, I wish we could accommodate everyone, but our gala is sold out. But many of you will be able to hear Marie Yovanovitch, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, and that will be yet another perspective. And with each passing day, because of the changing developments, that story changes. So what will history tell us? How will we view what Dr. Friedman said today in the light of the discussion on May 18th? Now, I would not be a good executive director if I didn't encourage everyone to sign up for our newsletter, look for a new website soon, become a member. If you're already a member, invite someone to come with you to the next event. If you're a lapsed member, you see where we're headed and what we offer. So thank you. We couldn't do it without members like you. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Friedman, and thank you to our staff. Please, if you see them, give them a nod of gratitude. They're doing amazing work with a lot going on. So thank you all. Take care.